So, Lori, rip rollicking conversation we're off to this morning. Start with what you heard and what you would push back on, if anything.
Well, that's going to be difficult. I was sitting in the green room, so I didn't get to hear much of it.
Yeah.
But I can probably anticipate a lot of what I heard.
One of the questions I asked was about a focus on prescription drugs.
Yeah.
And the senator made the point that this is an area where we have seen big growth over the past few years in spending, and that it's an area where she's seen both patient outcries and an opportunity for bipartisan collaboration to address the spending, the root causes of some of that, that increase in spending.
Okay, well, let me take a couple of those points. First, it's absolutely fair to say in 2014 and 2015 we saw a spike in prescription drug spending. A lot of that was due to a new cure for hepatitis C. In fact, about half of the spending growth in 2014 was as a result of that cure. Of course, it also happened to be in 2014 and 2015 we had record numbers of new drugs coming to the market. We also had the first year that the Medicaid expansion had occurred and the lowest number of drugs coming off patent. So yes, we saw a spike, but in my mind it's not really smart from a policy perspective to take a look at just one period of time, meaning 1 year or 2 years. You've got to look out over a period of time. So if you look back over the past decade, a recent IMS report found that per capita drug cost growth was at 1.1% on average per year over the last decade, 1.1% per year over the last decade. So again, not trivial, but in context, it's important. Prior to 2014 and 2015, there was almost anemic levels of prescription drug spending growth. Again, we had a peak. This past year, growth was anywhere from 3 to 5%, and all projections suggest over the next decade it's going to be stable. Prescription drugs still account for about 14% of total prescription drug spending across the country. That's both medicines used at the retail pharmacy as well as medicines that are used in the hospital setting and the physician spending. And again, that's projected to remain stable. An important point to note too, that 14%, half of it is brand drugs. So 7 of that 14%, half is brand drugs. The other half is generic drugs and the costs associated with the supply chain. Kind of an interesting point of comparison, we spend about 8% on administrative costs in this country. So we're spending more on administrative costs than we're spending on prescription drugs in the U.S. And I would argue that we're getting a lot for that 14% or 7% in the case of brand name drugs. We've got new cures for hepatitis C. We have a revolution in cancer therapies. We've made tremendous progress against HIV/AIDS, and there's a lot more promise in the pipeline to come. Now,
every number in this arena is contested, and so that 14% is one of those figures. I'm curious. One of the complex dynamics of this market is the fact that we can't actually see into some of what goes into drug companies, pharmaceutical researchers' decisions. Why should we give pharmaceutical manufacturers as much power as we do to set prices?
Well, I would argue that pharmaceuticals, probably unlike any part of the healthcare system, the negotiation for the ultimate price of that product is negotiated between a manufacturer and oftentimes a pharmacy benefit manager or an insurance company. So today, about 75% of every prescription medicine is purchased by just 3 pharmacy benefit managers. And they have significant sway over the price of medicines. Example, over the past 3 years, we've seen rebates and discounts that pharmaceutical companies provide increase almost 40%, to the tune of about $106 billion in 2015 in discounts and rebates. So those prices are negotiated in a very competitive market where insurance companies say, if you don't give us the price you want, we're not going to cover your product. If you increase the price, we're going to ask you to pay an additional rebate on top of it, a price protection rebate. If you don't give us the price you want, you're going to be on the highest tier of the formulary, and we're going to ask patients to pay an increasingly large share of their costs. So to say that prescription medicines, there's not significant negotiation, I think is a huge, huge misnomer. There is a lot of negotiation that's happening, and it plays out in publicly available data in terms of rebates and the like.
Matt, that is almost a segue to you. You've been on both sides on two sides of this multifaceted.
I'm a reformed pharmaceutical executive.
you were at Pfizer for several years, and now you're at AHIP. And how has that informed your view of the way we construct this challenge?
Great question. Thanks for having me here. So the world is very different today in which pharmaceutical companies operate, I think, compared to, say, about a decade ago, right? And there are some good things and some bad things. The good things. Some of the treatments are really breakthrough, and being able to provide more targeted therapies, that is terrific. That said, we face enormous challenges, I think, from a systemic perspective, when you look at cost, when you look at prices. We have really a price problem in the United States. And remember the old James Carville adage, it's the price, stupid, not the economy in this case, because our unit prices are much too high. When you look at launch prices in the United States, our launch prices are very high. And we see rates of price increases across our system, despite the use of negotiations through pharmacy benefit managers and our members. As a result of the system that we've created, whereby we essentially have government-granted monopolies, right, that give market exclusivity for extended periods of time. We have patent estates that wrap around this period of market exclusivity, and you have to ask yourself, why is it 20-plus years that we've seen some of the most expensive biologics out on the market, and we do not have a true biosimilars market in the United States. I remember being in the industry, a decade ago and saying, oh, we need to talk about, biosimilars are coming, biosimilars are coming. Here we are 10 years later, and we barely have any biosimilars competition. We need some real market to evolve in that place. I mean, I don't know that anyone believes that we will ultimately get to the commodity type prices that you see when a small molecule genericized market comes out. Where you see 90, 95% discounts. But if we are only going to be able to realize, say, 15 or 20% savings on these products, we are going to maintain our affordability problem in the United States.
Now, doesn't some of the upfront pricing for pharmaceuticals, for new pharmaceuticals, fund a big part of the introduction of later new drugs?
Sure, in some level, right, that pharmaceutical companies need to pay for research and development. But it is a fundamental fallacy of the industry, of the pharmaceutical industry, that there's any direct connection between the cost of research and development for a particular product and its price. I've sat in numerous pricing committee discussions, launching products. Not once did anyone say, how much do we spend on R&D for this product? It really was, what would the market bear? What is out there from a competitive landscape, if there is anything, and how much can we charge in that regard? And so, that's one of the big problems, and there have been some recent studies that look at the overall cost of research and development, right? And there's the sort of Pharma aggregate number where they fold in every single product, every single cost, and come up with a very inflated number of, say, about $2 billion to, bring a new drug to market. There was a recent study that came out that said it's a lot lower than that, probably a couple $100 million. That's not to say that we want to get these products out there more efficiently, but it's not $2 billion to bring every product to market.
Lori, let me offer you the chance to respond to this.
I have a lot to respond to. I'm going to start, though, so I don't forget to make the point. Matt talked about what's different in the pharmaceutical industry over the last 10 years. I want to talk about what's different in the insurance industry in the last 10 years. We're now at a point in time where patients are being asked to pay a lion's share of their costs, to the point of, I would argue, it doesn't feel like insurance to a lot of patients. Today, for many patients, they have deductibles. They never used to have deductibles for prescription medicines. They do today, oftentimes as high as $3,000 or $4,000. When they go to the pharmacy counter at the beginning of the month, they're asked to pay the list price of the drug. Insurance companies and pharmacy benefit managers are not passing on the discounts and rebates that we provide to them on to the patient at the point of sale. And that's a problem because today we have, again, an increasing number of patients who are paying $3,000 or $4,000, maybe going through most of the year till they feel like they have insurance. When they get to the phase of their insurance, an increasing number of them are asked to pay a % of the price of the list price of the drug. So again, not reflecting the rich discounts and rebates that are provided to them. So, you know, that has changed significantly. And quite honestly, that is in part why patients today are struggling to afford their medicine. It's not like the days of 5 years ago when you went to the pharmacy counter January 1 and you paid a flat copay for your drug. Today, you go to the pharmacy counter and you're asked to pay the list price month after month after month until you reach your deductible, and then you're asked to pay a % of the price of it. So that's one point, and that is in part, I think, a big reason that's fueling this debate. On the research and development cost, you know, our companies go to work every day to bring new cures and treatments to patients. Unfortunately, the business model we have is not a great one in terms of success stories, right? 90% of what we do fails. And let me just give you one example, Alzheimer's. We have one of our companies that's invested to date over $3 billion over the last 25 years trying to get a treatment to the market for Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in this country. It's the only one in the top 10 where there is no treatment that cures, prevents, or delays its onset. It's going to cost our society $1 trillion by 2050. Right? We need companies to make those kinds of investments. But how can we make an investment of $3 billion and fail and fail and fail if there's not an ability to, again, recoup not just those costs for the ones that make it to market, but for all of those that never make it to market?
Yeah, this is one of the key factors that differentiates some of those figures that you were citing, isn't it, Matt? That, you know, the 200 million figure is a parsimonious view, perhaps, of what
it's probably higher than that, but still, there is a big gulf between.
Right. So, how would you say we should think about innovation, and particularly the U.S.'s distinctive role in innovation in how we price pharmaceuticals in America?
Right. I mean, we are funding the rest of the world. There's no doubt of it. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's been happening for decades, and you know that trend is not changing, particularly as other countries, you know, continue to sort of clamp down on prices in a way that we have not. And that's a particular challenge. I'd say from a pricing perspective, though, what's also important to think about is really what is a price that, you know, is reasonable to give a rate of return that does not try and capture sort of the entire value, the entire net present value of all direct and indirect medical costs. I mean, that's where we've seen pricing going in the United States, is that companies are trying to extract every single last dollar from the healthcare system and even indirect costs and trying to justify their prices. When they have a very, very high launch price. And I think we need to have a conversation about like what makes sense, what's sustainable, and what is reasonable. Right? Pharmaceutical companies are the only you know, part of the healthcare system that really doesn't have this level of transparency into how it's operating with respect to you know, how prices get set. Every insurance you know, product that's out there in the market has some level of oversight through state departments of insurance, through the federal government. There's nothing equivalent that exists in the pharmaceutical industry. We need some basic transparency in the system to understand really how is it that these prices are being arrived at, what are some of the inputs, and what makes sense, because it really is the only part of the healthcare system where that doesn't exist right now.
We have represented here pharmaceutical companies, we have payers represented here. But a big part of the obfuscation and the complexity, the opacity of healthcare as a market is the distance between customers and the things that they're paying for. What do you think, how do we improve the whole system for getting more of a market dynamic into healthcare and drug pricing?
Right, and I do think it comes back to this notion of transparency, of greater transparency. of what the inputs are into pharmaceutical companies.
But I guess I would ask, do you think many decisions made by, for example, providers in the hospital setting are also a core part of what's driving an increase in spending? And what responsibility do you think that our providers have in considering other alternatives to things that might just be habit?
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of effort to provide much greater transparency across the entire system so that providers who are being able, or not who are being able, who are being asked to accept more responsibility for financial outcomes, not just healthcare outcomes, are looking at what are the inputs going into the total cost of care. And pharmaceuticals, obviously, depending upon what therapeutic area you're talking about, can play a very big part. And it's important that we include those drug costs when we're looking at the total cost. In many cases, they're outside. For example, in the Medicare Shared Savings Program, with the whole ACO concept, right? Part D costs aren't really factored in directly in the same way. Many health plans, as they're looking at their commercial business and the arrangements that they're putting out with health systems, are trying to factor in the total costs to make sure that the incentives are aligned and that providers are looking at what are the costs, including drugs, of providing care for particular patients.
Yeah. Can I jump in terms of the question that I think you asked, which is the supply chain? As you mentioned, we have a very complex supply chain where we sell a product. There was a recent study that came out in January that found that of every dollar of list price of a prescription drug sold, the manufacturer, the brand name manufacturer, retains about 62 cents of it. The rest of that, almost 40 cents, is going to other people in the supply chain. I mentioned before a big chunk of it that goes in the form of discounts and rebates to health insurance companies, mandated government rebates that have to get paid to them, the cost that goes to the pharmacy benefit managers, the pharmacies, and the wholesalers. And Matt talked a lot about transparency, but again, we'd like to see transparency across the entire supply chain, including in the hospital setting where drugs are commonly marked up as much as 600% over the price charged. So transparency is great, presuming it applies to everyone, including the health plans, in terms of how much of the rebates and discounts they retain and use for whatever purposes they want, and how much of it actually gets passed back to the ultimate patient who needs those discounts and rebates.
Lori, a big part of the debate as it plays out publicly is driven by some pretty striking stories. The senator and I talked about the EpiPen hike. Earlier in the year. And those are a big vehicle for an engine for a lot of the patient outcry that we see around pricing. How should we think about a drug that costs suddenly 3 times what it did 2 years ago?
Right. Well, unfortunately, there have been a number of stories, whether it was Daraprim, the HIV/AIDS drug that took a huge increase in price, or the issue with EpiPen. We've been on the record saying that more needs to be done to ensure that we speed the entry of competing products to market. I would argue in the case of Daraprim, you had an example of a company that took advantage of regulatory arbitrage. They knew at the time that any competitor that tried to get a competing generic to the marketplace would face years in terms of FDA approval of that product. I think more is being done, and I would argue that Scott Gottlieb has done a great job already of advancing some ideas that hopefully we won't end up in those kinds of situations. But I would say today that regulatory arbitrage existed for a long time. We need to stop that because we do need to speed entry of products to compete.
How do you feel about some of Senator Klobuchar's bipartisan efforts to introduce just competition just like that, like the Short on Competition Act?
Well, there's lots of different ideas in terms of how we address drug costs, and I would say we've put forth a number of ideas as well. I mentioned one already, which is how do we ensure that discounts find their way back to the ultimate patient. We also think more needs to be done to encourage purchasing around the value of medicine. We understand the health system is changing, that the days of buying medicines based on volume are likely over. We hear consistently from payers that they want to pay for value of medicines. We want to meet them in that point, but we need help from government in terms of looking at, I would say, outdated regulations that haven't been updated to reflect this kind of movement going forward. We also, as I mentioned before, need to to advance FDA regulatory changes as well to ensure that we speed the entry of competing products to market. So there are ideas, absolutely ideas to lower drug costs in this country. We've been very, outward suggesting an agenda of our own in order to do that. So we're not saying that there's not a problem, no one should look here, but I think some of the solutions that we've heard, I worry about the impact, the long-term impact to innovation down the road.
In a few moments, I'd like to bring in a couple of audience questions, and keeping in mind that this is quite a complex, multifaceted issue, and I'd love to hear from some perspectives that we haven't heard represented on stage. But first, I want to ask you both a question. Where do you find the most agreement?
Where do we find the most agreement? So I'd say probably in the area of competition. How do we make sure that we get products to market more quickly, whether they be on the generic side or if there's no competing therapy within a particular class, so that we can get some competition? I'd say that's probably one area. I'd say the other is around the move towards value-based pricing. However, I'd say there's a lot more skepticism, I'd say, on my side of the house about whether or not value-based pricing will actually lead to net reductions in spending. And are we going to solve our pricing problem by going to that type of system? I think everyone wants to pay for value, but I think the jury is definitely out about how those agreements will ultimately impact spending within and the pricing problems that we face. Right, the insidious pricing problem that we have really is not the extreme examples. It's the year-over-year inflation of 9, 10, 20%. When you have companies out there, raising their hand and saying, "I'm a good actor. I'm going to raise, prices less than double digits," and they come in at 9.9%, when the rest of the healthcare system is much, much lower, and really trying to put that's not great corporate behavior. That's just not the way that that we're going to address some of the problems that we face. And when that is rampant across the branded industry, and you have companies who are now backing off from some of these pledges, you're like, what's really going on here?
Well, I would like to address that before I talk about what we agree with. So last year, price growth in the pharmaceutical industry was 2.5%. Of course, there are examples. There's always going to be examples where there are products that are raised higher than 2.5%. But the average across the entire pharmaceutical industry was 2.5%. There's been a lot of attempts by pharmacy benefit managers and insurers to keep prices low. I mentioned one of them before, where most PBMs today have contracts in place which say if you raise your price above a certain level, you have to rebate us back additional money as a way to keep prices low. So I think we're in a different era in terms of price growth relative to where we've been.
Now bring us all together.
Bring us all together. Okay. I do think, to Matt's point, that how do we pay for outcomes, how do we pay for value, is one where we do agree. I've heard some of the criticism that Matt is saying, but I would say a recent study by Humana and Pfizer found, in the case of cholesterol, that you could have 22% lower costs as a result of an outcomes-based contract. So I think there is hope there. We're still in the infancy of these, so obviously there will be more coming forward, but our companies are committed to a different pricing model and one that's based on value.
Let me share the stage and hear some questions back there.
Hi, this is Evan Shore. I had a question.
Please state just who you are and where you're from for us.
Just independent person.
All right.
Was wondering, in a lot of other industries, you don't have these intermediaries that are negotiating prices, and you get this competition and nice market dynamics. Here you have payers and PBMs that are in the middle. And value-based pricing would be in the vein of the negotiated prices as well. Might there be an opportunity to create a marketplace that the pharma companies come in and post their prices, and so maybe starting in self-pay consumers, there's just a much simpler infrastructure, and then you won't have that 40% of the cost of a drug?
My sense is we're going to see disruption in this marketplace for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. Increasingly, we're seeing states do reverse auctions with their pharmacy benefit manager to try and lower the cost, because quite honestly, the value that is created in the system is created by the creation of the medicine. But 40% of the price is getting eaten by others in the supply chain. So I think there is more to be done to squeeze some of the costs out of that supply chain. The good news about consolidation in the PBM and insurance industry has been significant competition, right? That has led to these really, really big rebates. That's all great if patients are benefiting directly from them. But today those rebates and discounts are kept, and they're kept because Matt's companies want to lower premiums, a laudable goal. But for a lot of patients who rely on medicines, the end result is they're paying much more so than what their insurance company is paying for that medicine. We think that needs to change.
I think that's not commonplace within the industry. So think about, well, one thing that's important to remember is the market dynamic that you're talking about. It can't be a true market when you have a government-granted monopoly through the patent system or through market exclusivity. So that's one point. The second point is that the whole rebate discussion, rebates were actually created by the pharmaceutical industry many decades ago as a way to discriminate against different classes of trade. And I won't get into all the details around that, but it was really an artifact of the pharmaceutical industry that was created. And when you think about the prices of products, let's say there was a rebate of 20% on a $1,000 a month product. Do you think a patient feels any better if they were paying $800 a month instead of $1,000 a month? Yeah. Going into the pharmacy, it really starts with the price. And if prices were lower, we wouldn't have this problem.
Over here in the back. And once again, tell us who you are and what your affiliation, if anything, is.
Thank you very much. My name is Edward Abrahams. I'm from the Personalized Medicine Coalition. So one of the great opportunities to increase value and actually reduce systemic costs would be to figure out for whom particular drugs work and for whom they don't work. My question is to Matt. In order to do that, you've got to link therapy to diagnostics, and yet there's continued downward pressure from payers on diagnostics, that, especially those that have not met controlled randomized clinical trial standards. What can payers do to help advance this vision of targeting therapy to patients for whom they work and for whom they don't?
Right, and I think that that's another area of alignment, is wanting to get the right product to the right patient at the right time at the lowest possible cost. Right, when we're talking about these very targeted therapies, we're getting into a whole new frontier, both in terms of pricing, the need for diagnostics. We've seen more collaborations between manufacturers and payers, especially bringing this information early in the process, and that's something, probably another area where we've been supportive of working on together. But I think it is a challenge, if we're talking about a product to just put out a hypothetical price, say of $1 million that we've heard for some of these new therapies out there, we still need to figure out, like, how do we get to the fundamental price issue and how do we solve this problem? Because at that price, you're talking about the ability to provide insurance coverage for, say, 40 or 50 families for one therapy, and we want to get those targeted therapies to people, but at a price I think that we can afford, and that's just a discussion that we're going to have to, have on an ongoing basis.
I want to move to one more question here.
Brian Bruin with George Washington University. So one thing that I heard in this discussion is actually a possible area for collaboration between the two industries, and that you both brought up rebates and the fact that they're not necessarily being passed through. And then you also, Lori, talked about the fact that so much of that is then, so much of the price is captured throughout the supply chain. Almost all of that is based on the initial price that's set by manufacturers. So why don't we just get rid of this whole silly rebate system, make the prices public, make them lower, and then the costs throughout the supply chain are lower, the amount that's kept is lower. It's more obvious for patients. Patients don't pay as much at the pharmacy counter because that's based on the initial price. And then we're all happy and prices are lower.
Amen.
Yeah, I think, I think there's been a lot of talk about what needs to change, because you're right, the supply chain today, everyone along that chain gets paid off the list price. right? The pharmacies, the wholesalers, the pharmacy benefit managers.
Who sets the list
They
price?
get paid off the, well, guess what? Guess who likes a high list price though, right? People that get a big discount and rebate off of
They would
that list
prefer
price.
a lower net price.
Well,
I guarantee you.
I
They would
think,
prefer a
I
lower
think
net
history
price.
begs to differ in terms of their coverage decisions. And I think if you look at how they make coverage decisions, it's quite interesting in terms of, do they give preferential coverage to low list prices, or do they give them to ones with high discounts and rebates?
Lori, I want to give you the opportunity to have the last word right now. You get a laser scalpel, and you get to redesign one giant corner of our healthcare industry to lower the cost of drug pricing for ordinary folks. Where do you put it?
I would require that the majority of discounts and rebates get passed through. I will tell you, if that happens, patients' costs will be lower. There'll be less incentive to game the system.
All right. Lori Reilly, Matt Eyles, thank you very much for joining us this
Thank you,
morning, and
Matt.
thanks to the rest of you. I look forward to a rollicking discussion for the rest of today. Take care.